Right now, as you watch this video, thousands of lines of code are running beneath you. Your browser, your operating system, the server that delivered this video to your screen. Almost none of it was built by a single company. And almost all of it runs on terms set by a legal document. Not a patent, not a trade secret, a license. One that was written, in part, by a programmer who believed that sharing code was a moral obligation, and another set of licenses written by people who thought that was going too far. The story of how open-source licensing became one of the most powerful technology accelerators in history is messier than the shorthand version. This is No Tech. Here is what most people think they know about open-source software. It's free. Anyone can use it. Anyone can modify it. It's the opposite of proprietary software, which costs money and locks you out. That story is not wrong, exactly, but it's missing almost everything that matters. Because free in this context has almost nothing to do with price. Richard Stallman, a programmer at MIT in the early 1980s, made that distinction famous. He wasn't trying to build a business model, he was trying to build a philosophy. And the tool he chose to encode that philosophy was a software license. The GNU General Public License, the GPL, didn't just give you the software. It gave you 4 specific freedoms: to run it, to study it, to modify it, and to redistribute your modifications. But here was the catch. And this is where the story gets interesting. If you distributed a modified version, you had to release it under the same license. Your freedom came with a legal obligation attached. That single clause set the terms for a decades-long argument about what open actually means and who it serves. Here is the tension that most introductions to open source skip entirely. The Free Software Foundation and the Open Source Initiative are not the same thing. They agree on most of the practical stuff. Nearly all software that meets one definition also meets the other. The overlap is real and substantial. But they disagree profoundly on why any of it matters. Stallman's camp, the free software movement, argues that software freedom is a moral question. Proprietary software, in their view, is not just inconvenient, it is unjust. The GNU project explicitly objects to its work being called open source because in the FSF's view, the term open source emphasizes pragmatic outcomes over the ethical foundation of software freedom. And that framing, they argue, obscures the moral case entirely. The open source camp, which coalesced around the Open Source Initiative in 1998, made a different argument. Forget the philosophy, they said. Look at the engineering outcomes. Open development produces better software. More eyes find more bugs. Distributed contribution scales in ways that closed teams cannot match. Both camps were right about different things, and both camps produced licenses that worked differently in practice. The GPL family, Copyleft licenses, required that distributed modifications stay open. They used legal obligation to enforce the commons. If you distributed a modified version of the code, you had to release that version's source under the same license. The license made that legally binding, not a matter of goodwill. The permissive licenses, MIT, BSD, Apache, asked for almost nothing in return. Take the code, use it commercially, modify it, keep your changes private if you want. The only common requirement was attribution. And this is where I started to wonder when I dug into this. Which approach actually accelerated technology more? The answer, it turns out,
depends entirely on what you mean by accelerate and who you're accelerating it for. Let's start with what we actually know happened. In 1983, Stallman launched the GNU project to build a free operating system from scratch. By the early 90s, the tools existed: compilers, editors, core utilities, but the kernel, the piece that actually talks to the hardware, was missing. Then, in 1991, a Finnish computer science student named Linus Torvalds posted a message to a news group. He was building a kernel. "Just a hobby," he wrote, "nothing big, won't be anything professional." He released it under the GPL.
That licensing decision shaped everything that followed. The GPL meant that anyone who distributed a modified version of Linux had to release that version's source code under the same license. The kernel could never be quietly absorbed into a proprietary product. No single company could capture it. Within a decade, Linux was running on servers that powered much of the early internet. Today, it runs on everything from smartphones to spacecraft. The compounding effect of that license clause, distribute modified versions only under the same terms, is difficult to overstate. Now here is where the permissive licenses enter the story. And this is where it gets genuinely surprising. The Apache HTTP server, which by the mid-2000s served the majority of websites on the internet, used a permissive license. Companies could embed it, modify it, and keep their changes proprietary. No copyleft obligation attached. Why did that accelerate adoption so dramatically? Because it removed the legal friction for corporations. A legal department at a large company in 1997 could approve an Apache-licensed component in an afternoon. A GPL-licensed component required months of review because of the copyleft obligations. The risk that distributing a product containing GPL code might require releasing that product's source code entirely. This is the mechanism that most histories of open source underemphasize. The license was not a legal formality stapled to the code. It was a design decision that determined who could participate, under what conditions, and at what speed. And then came Android. Android is built on a Linux kernel, GPL licensed. But the application framework layered around it uses the Apache license. That combination was deliberate, and it's worth understanding why. The GPL kernel meant the core platform stayed open. Any improvements to the kernel that were distributed had to be released under the same license. But the Apache licensed framework meant that device manufacturers, Samsung, LG, Motorola, could customize their implementations without being forced to open source those customizations. Was this a perfect outcome for software freedom? Stallman would say absolutely not. The fragmentation of Android across hundreds of device variants, with manufacturers locking down their layers, is precisely what the GPL was designed to prevent. Was it a massive accelerant for smartphone adoption globally, particularly in developing markets where affordable Android devices reached people who would never have accessed an iPhone? By 2023, Android powers roughly 70% of smartphones globally, though the trade-offs are real, and that debate is ongoing. And it wasn't just consumer technology where this pattern appeared. Open-source tools accelerated scientific computing, aerospace simulation, and genomics research, fields where sharing code meant sharing methods, and sharing methods meant faster, independent verification. In scientific computing contexts, open-source tools enable reviewers to read source code and verify the assumptions baked into the models, a practice that is particularly valuable in aerospace validation work, where the transparency of the method is not just philosophically appealing, but scientifically necessary. The same principle that Stallman encoded in the GPL for ethical reasons turned out to have enormous epistemic value in scientific contexts, for reasons that had nothing to do with the original argument. Here is what I kept coming back to as I traced this history. There is no single open-source story. There are at least 3 distinct stories running in parallel,
sometimes cooperating, sometimes in direct conflict. The ethics track gave us the GPL and the principle that software freedom must be legally enforced, not just trusted to goodwill. The engineering track gave us the permissive licenses that made open source legally safe for corporate adoption, and thereby funded the infrastructure that runs the internet. And the commercial track, dual licensing, open core models, gave companies a way to build sustainable businesses on open foundations without giving everything away. Each track produced real technology acceleration. Each also produced real friction with the others.
The GNU project's objection to the open source label is not a historical footnote. It reflects a genuine philosophical disagreement about whether pragmatic adoption without ethical commitment is worth celebrating. And they have a point worth taking seriously. The open source label, by focusing on practical outcomes rather than principles, made it easier for companies to participate, but it also made it easier to participate without any commitment to the underlying values that made the commons worth building in the first place. This tension has never fully resolved. It shapes which projects get funded, which get abandoned, and which become the infrastructure the rest of us depend on without ever thinking about it. So here is what I think the evidence actually shows. Open source licensing is not primarily about generosity. It is a legal mechanism for making collaboration self-sustaining. The GPL did not ask contributors to trust that their work would stay open. It made defection legally impossible, at the point of distribution. Copyleft is not a moral appeal. It is a contractual enforcement mechanism disguised as a sharing agreement. Distribute a modified version, and the license compels you to distribute the source under the same terms. The obligation triggers at the moment of distribution, not before. The permissive licenses did not ask corporations to be altruistic. They made adoption legally trivial, removing the friction that would have kept corporate engineering teams away entirely. Both approaches solved the same underlying problem, just for different participants and at different stages of the technology adoption curve. Copyleft kept the commons intact at the research and hobbyist stage. Permissive licenses opened the door at the corporate adoption stage. And the result was a compounding effect that no single company could have engineered deliberately. Linux, Apache, Android, the web stack that most of the internet runs on, the machine learning frameworks that power modern AI. Most of them trace their lineage back to a licensing decision made by someone who was, at least in part, trying to solve a legal problem, not just a technical one. The accelerant was not the code, it was the contract around the code. This history reminds us that the rules governing a technology often matter more than the technology itself. The license was the architecture. The code was just the material. And the story of open source licensing is not finished. New questions are emerging around AI-generated code, around models trained on open source repositories, and around what open even means when the training data and the model weights are controlled separately. These are not settled questions. They are active disputes being worked out in courtrooms, standards bodies, and the license files of projects you probably use every day. The philosophical arguments Stallman started in 1983 did not end with the rise of Linux or the commercial success of Apache. They mutated, and they are still running. I'm here to help you know the systems that shape what gets built and what gets locked away. Which licensing model do you think did more to accelerate real technology? Copyleft's legal enforcement of the commons? Or permissive licensing's frictionless corporate adoption? Drop your argument in the comments. See you at the next commit.